The Italian tech tree in War Thunder gives access to the Fiat G91ys. Quite an interesting aircraft. Let's check it out. So let's look at how the G91ys came to be. The original Fiat G91 came from a NATO program in 1953, calling for the development of a lightweight tactical strike fighter. There were a number of aircraft offered, with the G91 being selected and entering service in 1958. By this time, it was recognized that a subsonic gunfighter was an outdated paradigm, and the G91 was considered to be bordering on obsolescence as soon as it started flying. Out in real life, the Fiat G91 was a relatively minor aircraft in the overall history of, military aviation, with less than 1,000 being built and only flying with 3 primary operators. But in War Thunder, the G91 is a major player, with most of the German and Italian air tree players are going to be spending some time in it. Back in real life, in the 1960s, the Italian government initiated and funded a project to improve the performance of the basic G91, which eventually resulted in the G91Y. The G91Y is visually similar, but in fact, the aircraft was mostly redesigned. The obvious visual difference is the change from one engine to 2, but there were also significant internal structural changes and some minor aerodynamic refinements as well, and major updates to the plane's avionics and electronics equipment, although it still did not contain a conventional radar set and was still a subsonic aircraft despite being introduced at the end of the 1960s. Less than 80 were built in total, and the G91Y was largely considered to be a stopgap rather than, a new evolutionary step that could be the backbone of the Italian Air Force. What we have in War Thunder is the G91YS, not the regular Y. The YS was a one-off prototype which flew in 1970 as part of an effort to sell the plane to Switzerland, which ultimately failed. The major difference between the basic G91Y is just the addition of 2 more wing pylons. The weapon system of the plane seems somewhat focused on ground attack. You get a ballistics computer with the CCIP for all of your weapons, but no radar set to speak of. Not even a radar gun sight. The weapon loadouts include bombs, rocket pods, and a pair of air-to-air missiles, but the only missile is the basic AIM-9B, which isn't especially competitive at BR 9.7, but it's something. The CCIP makes the bombs and rockets pretty easy to deploy against ground targets, and even makes the G91YS effective in close air support. But the plane has no countermeasures and ends up being highly vulnerable to SPAA in ground battles. The flight performance of the G91YS comes up a little short. The plane is slightly faster than the regular G91 and accelerates quite well with its 2 afterburning engines, but it hits an aerodynamic brick wall at 0.92 Mach, and its turn rate is slightly worse at all altitudes. Combat flaps can be deployed up to about 580 kilometers an hour, but it's a serious trade-off and speed will drain much faster. The new control booster upgrade is absolutely essential with this plane, so try to grind up to that pretty early on, in your upgrade process. Now, despite some pretty excessive wing flutter, the plane is pretty stable, and aiming its air-to-ground weapons is relatively easy. The cannons punch hard, over 10 kilograms per second, but the ballistics on them feels a little odd in a way that I can't really explain. I never got quite really comfortable dogfighting with them. If you work on the G91YS and practice a bit, you can probably get a feel for the guns, but I switch around to different planes too much, and I never really got comfortable with them. The good news, of course, is that when you actually hit something, it usually goes down. Flying the G91YS out into missions is pretty typical subsonic fighter-bomber stuff. You start on the runway in air battles, no air spawn, and your flight performance is reduced quite a bit if you load up on bombs, so if you take out any air-to-ground ordnance, you're basically committing to cleaning up leftover ground targets or making it to a base before going after air targets. Otherwise, this is generally a pretty basic fighter. The rate of climb is good, so if you're addicted to eating semi-active radar missiles, you can climb high, but otherwise it's probably best to keep the fighting low with this one. The plane sits at BR 9.7, which is waist deep into missile thunder, but without any countermeasures or even a radar set. This means that you need to keep your situational awareness 100% on point, and even a minor lapse or a few seconds of tunnel vision can get your tailpipe a date with an R60, since manual evasion is basically your only defense. The G91ys also isn't the most maneuverable turn fighter, so you can get danced on by Sabres, MiG-17s, and most of the other subsonic dogfighters, but it isn't fast enough to keep up with the supersonic planes it gets paired into. I had a difficult time with this plane, and I frequently found myself in situations where I was in a tough dogfight with another medium-speed gunfighter, but having a higher-speed plane just making passes back and forth on me while I was busy, dogfighting a MiG-19 or something. I also ran into something I've rarely experienced outside of low-tier prop gameplay: being stranded. There were a few matches where, I was the only one left on my team, or there were only a couple of us, while the enemy team was entirely made up of like Su-7s or F-104s, and I just could never get close enough to engage anything, and the match dragged out forever. Overall, the G91ys is challenging, but not especially frustrating to fly out into regular air battles. Visually, I think the G91ys is an okay-looking plane. The tail has a bit of an odd rectangular structure below the vertical stabilizer, but otherwise the plane has very clean lines, and its nose kind of reminds me of a shark. Unfortunately, we only get one additional paint job. It's from an Italian squadron, and I have to say I was really let down that we didn't at least get a Swiss Air Force skin, considering that the actual version of the G91Y we're flying was, intended for Switzerland. Landing this plane absolutely takes a little practice. The key issue is that the landing gear and the flaps both rip at about 375 kilometers an hour, which is lower than the 400 or so that most people seem to drop them at flying at this BR. You have to remind yourself that this plane lands much slower than the fast jets that it's flying with, and you have to dump a lot more speed before final approach. The silver lining is that the air brake is effective and the plane has a great drag chute. The cockpit visuals are also decent. Flying out in VR, I really liked the gun sight and the visibility. My only gripe is that I kind of wish the primary instruments were a little higher up. To close out on the G91ys, this plane has great acceleration and a good rate of climb, and the ballistics computer gives the CCIP for all of its weapons. However, the plane's low maximum speed is a handicap. It has no countermeasures, and the AIM-9B just isn't competitive as your only missile option in this BR bracket. The final verdict on the G91ys is that this plane can be fun to fly, but it has trouble finding a dedicated role to fall into. It's kind of a jack of most trades, master of none, and my overall impression is that it's more useful for close air support and ground RB than it is as a primary flyer in air battles. As always, thanks for watching.